Eleanor Parker, a 37-year-old woman, had always been an example of determination. After years of hard work as a financial consultant, she had finally achieved her dreams. A solid career, a stylish apartment in downtown Denver, and a comfortable routine. But despite how perfect her life seemed from the outside, Eleanor felt something was missing. Love was a gap she couldn't seem to fill. It was at a charity event organized by a mutual friend that Eleanor met Winston Harrington, a 40-year-old businessman. He was charming, articulate, and had a sparkle in his eyes that made her momentarily forget her worries. Winston stood out in the crowd not just because of his looks but because of the way he seemed genuinely interested in every word Eleanor said. Early in their conversation, he revealed that he had also grown up in a humble family before building his empire in real estate. His stories of overcoming struggles captivated Eleanor, who saw in him not just an attractive man but someone she could connect with deeply. By the end of the evening, Winston asked for her phone number, saying he'd love to continue their conversation. Hesitant, Eleanor agreed. It was rare for her to feel so at ease with someone so quickly. In the following days, Winston kept in constant contact. He sent messages, called her at night, and surprised Eleanor with small gestures, like flowers delivered to her office. Before long, he invited her to dinner at one of the city's most sophisticated restaurants. During the date, Winston appeared even more charming, knowing just what to say to make her smile. Eleanor, who had always been cautious in relationships, began to feel that Winston might be different. He made a point of showing that he wanted something serious. Winston constantly praised her, valuing not just her beauty but also her intelligence and independence. However, her best friend, Harriet, wasn't convinced. Harriet had known Eleanor since their college days and was aware of how much she had suffered in past relationships. When Eleanor mentioned Winston for the first time, Harriet said, "Just be careful, Ellie. Sometimes men who seem too good to be true are exactly that, too good to be true." Eleanor laughed, believing Harriet was just being overprotective. Still, the doubt her friend had planted lingered in her mind. But every time she saw Winston, her worries disappeared. He was warm, attentive, and always knew how to make Eleanor feel special. As the weeks passed, the relationship progressed quickly. Winston began talking about future plans, like trips together and even the idea of building something more serious. He claimed Eleanor was exactly the kind of woman he had always been looking for. Strong, authentic, and confident. Eleanor started to feel like she was living a fairy tale. Yet, at the same time, some small actions from Winston made her question if everything was as perfect as it seemed. For instance, he was secretive about his past and avoided talking about his family. When she asked, he skillfully changed the subject, saying he preferred to focus on the present. To Eleanor, this seemed like the charm of someone wanting to leave old problems behind. However, for Harriet, this was a clear red flag. He never talks about who he really is, Ellie. Don't you think that's strange? Harriet pressed during one of the few conversations she managed to have with her friend. No, Harriet. He's just private, that's all. Not everyone likes to open up about their life right away, you know, Eleanor replied, trying to push away the doubts. Winston quickly became a constant presence in Eleanor's life. He made a point of always being there, whether with sweet morning messages or phone calls at the end of the day. It was as if he knew exactly how to fill the empty spaces in her routine. Eleanor, used to handling everything on her own, began to feel cared for in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. In no time, Winston began making grand gestures. He took her on a helicopter ride over the mountains, an unexpected gift that left Eleanor speechless. During the flight, he held her hand and said, "You are the most incredible woman I've ever met. I would do anything to make you happy." Eleanor felt her heart race. Even though Harriet had planted doubts about Winston, he seemed genuine. His gestures, his words, and the way he made her feel were hard to question. She started to imagine a future with him, something that had once felt impossible. One evening, during a romantic dinner, Eleanor decided to ask more about Winston's past. Curious about his childhood and family, she tried to bring up the topic casually. "You never talk about your parents or siblings. Do they still live nearby?" Winston was silent for a few seconds, something rare for someone so eloquent. He answered with a restrained smile. "My family and I went our separate ways. I prefer not to get into the details, you know? Some stories are better left in the past." Although his answer left Eleanor intrigued, she didn't want to press him. After all, Everyone has their secrets, she thought. Harriet, however, wasn't convinced when Eleanor mentioned this in a conversation. Ellie, that's weird. He's hiding something, and you need to find out what. But Eleanor was in love. And when Winston surprised her that same week with an elegant necklace, saying it was just a symbol of how he wanted her to feel special, her worries started to fade. Winston seemed to be everything she'd ever wanted, and Eleanor didn't want to risk losing that. As Winston continued to show his charming side, Eleanor began to notice something peculiar. He was incredibly private about his own friends and social circles. While he was always present at her activities, Winston never invited her to meet his friends or learn about his business. He claimed that the two of them needed more time together before sharing the outside world. Despite this, Eleanor remained immersed in the relationship. Winston made her feel desired and important in a way she had never experienced. However, Harriet didn't let go of her concerns. Ellie, I know you're happy, but things are moving too fast. When something feels this perfect, there's usually something behind it. Eleanor laughed. You're seeing problems where there are none, Harriet. For the first time in my life, I think I've found someone who truly values me. Even with her confident words, something in the back of her mind started to question whether Harriet might be right. Shortly after, Winston suggested that Eleanor work less to have more time for them. He insisted she didn't need to worry so much about her career. You work so hard, Ellie. Why not take some time to relax? You deserve to enjoy life. At first, Eleanor found the idea appealing. She had never had someone who wanted to take care of her in this way. However, when Harriet heard about it, she became even more concerned. He wants you to work less? Ellie, doesn't that seem strange to you? But Eleanor, deeply in love, decided to ignore the warnings. Winston made her believe she was living a fairy tale, and she desperately wanted it to be real. As time went on, Eleanor and Winston's relationship remained intense and filled with memorable moments. He always seemed to know how to surprise her, whether it was a weekend getaway or a candlelit dinner. However, small details began to bother her. She noticed that Winston avoided certain topics and that his attention was often excessively focused on her, as if he were trying to distract her from something. One Sunday afternoon, Eleanor and Winston were walking in the park when he received a phone call. As soon as he looked at the screen, Winston tensed up and declined the call. Who was it? Eleanor asked, curious. Winston smiled, trying to appear casual. Just a client. Nothing important. Despite his light tone, Eleanor noticed the discomfort in his expression. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Winston stepped away, claiming he needed to handle something urgent. He took more than 15 minutes to return, and when he did, he seemed irritated. Eleanor decided not to press him, but an uneasy feeling started to grow in her chest. The following week, Eleanor decided to mention the incident to Harriet during a conversation. As expected, Harriet didn't hold back her opinion. Ellie, that's a clear sign he's hiding something. You need to investigate. Eleanor sighed, trying to push away the growing discomfort. Maybe he's just busy with work. I don't want to come off as one of those paranoid people. Harriet stared at her intently. And what if it's not that? You can't ignore these signs. Trust isn't just about what he says. It's about what he does. Harriet's words echoed in Eleanor's mind for the next few days. As much as she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not long after, Winston began to show a side of himself that Eleanor hadn't seen before. He started questioning some of her friendships and suggesting that certain people weren't good for her. Harriet seems to always be putting you against me. Don't you think she might be jealous of our relationship? Winston commented one evening. Eleanor tried to defend her friend, but Winston insisted. I just want to protect you, Ellie. Sometimes, the people we think are friends don't really have our best interests at heart. Reluctantly, Eleanor began to avoid sharing certain things with Harriet. She didn't want to create conflicts, but she also didn't want to lose her friend. At the same time, she started to notice that Winston was trying to isolate her from the people she trusted most. One day, while Winston was in the shower, Eleanor saw his phone vibrate on the coffee table. It was a message from an unnamed number. We need to talk. I can't wait any longer. Eleanor's heart raced. She knew opening someone else's phone was an invasion of privacy, but something inside her told her she needed to know what was going on. Before she could decide, Winston appeared, still wet and wrapped in a towel. Is something wrong, darling? Eleanor, nervous, simply smiled and shook her head. No, nothing. But the message lingered in her mind, and the distrust that had been growing became almost impossible to ignore. A few days later, Eleanor decided to confront Winston about her suspicions. She chose her words carefully, trying not to sound accusatory. Winston, I feel like you've been distant lately. Is there something you're not telling me? Winston laughed, but his tone felt forced. Ellie, you're imagining things. Why would I hide anything from you? Despite his reassuring answer, Winston's reaction only reinforced Eleanor's feeling that he was hiding something. For the first time, Eleanor began to question whether the man she was so in love with was truly who he claimed to be. Eleanor could no longer ignore the signs. Every gesture from Winston, once so charming, now seemed shrouded in mystery. Harriet's words echoed in her mind. You can't ignore these signs. Determined to uncover the truth, she began paying closer attention to Winston's behavior, searching for answers to the unease growing inside her. One morning, while Winston was sound asleep, his phone vibrated again. This time, Eleanor couldn't resist. With trembling hands, she picked up the device and saw a new message from the same anonymous number. If you don't resolve this soon, I'll have to take matters into my own hands. Her heart raced. Who was sending these messages? And what did Winston need to resolve? She tried to unlock the phone, but it was password protected. Before she could do anything else, Winston stirred, and Eleanor quickly placed the device back on the nightstand. Good morning, darling. Anything new? He asked with a carefree smile. Eleanor tried to play it cool, but something in her expression betrayed her. No, nothing. I was just thinking about work. Winston pulled her close, kissing her forehead, but Eleanor felt a different kind of chill, as if she were embracing a stranger. Determined to learn more, Eleanor decided to act discreetly. She started paying attention to Winston's schedules and commitments. One afternoon, he said he had an important meeting and rushed out. Determined, Eleanor followed him, keeping a safe distance. He parked at a discreet cafe in the city center and went inside without noticing her. Eleanor, hiding behind a column, saw Winston sit with a blonde woman, elegant and visibly nervous. They spoke intensely, gesturing frequently. Eleanor couldn't hear what they were saying, but the closeness between them unsettled her. When the woman touched Winston's hand, Eleanor's stomach turned. Who was she? And why did she seem so familiar with him? When Winston returned home that evening, Eleanor tried to stay calm, but her doubts were stronger than ever. How was the meeting? She asked casually. It was great. A client is interested in a new project, something big, Winston replied, with the ease of someone who had nothing to hide. Eleanor wanted to confront him about what she had seen, but she feared it would lead to an explosive argument. She decided to wait, believing that patience would bring her more answers. Unsure of what to do, Eleanor turned to Harriet for advice. She told her everything: the messages, the woman at the cafe, and the growing feeling that Winston was hiding something big. As always, Harriet was blunt. Ellie, this has gone too far. He's lying, and you need to act before it's too late. Harriet suggested Eleanor dig deeper, but also warned her about the emotional toll of staying in a relationship full of secrets. You deserve someone honest, Ellie, not someone who leaves you questioning everything. Her friend's words gave Eleanor courage, but she knew the next step had to be calculated. Part of her still wanted to believe in Winston, even if all the evidence pointed to the contrary. That same week, while Winston was in the shower, Eleanor used his laptop to access her own account. However, before logging out, something caught her attention. An open email from a company she didn't recognize. The message was short but revealing. The situation is under control. There will be no issues with Eleanor. A chill ran down her spine. Who were these people? And why were they discussing her as if she were part of some plan? This time, she knew she needed answers, but she had no idea how to get them without provoking Winston. Fear and distrust were consuming Eleanor. The mysterious messages, the encounter with the blonde woman, and the disturbing email made it clear that Winston was hiding something serious. Even so, Eleanor hesitated to confront him directly, afraid he would flee before she could get concrete answers. Determined to uncover more, Eleanor decided to do something she never imagined she would: investigate Winston. The next morning, while he was out, she searched for anything suspicious in his home. Inside a drawer in his office, she found a locked folder. Curious, She picked up a key that seemed to fit and opened it. Inside were contracts, bank documents, and a photo of Winston with another woman. Not the blonde from the cafe, but a younger woman with familiar features. Eleanor's heart raced. Who was this woman? Why had Winston hidden these documents? With every new clue, the puzzle became more confusing. Desperate, Eleanor turned to Harriet again and showed her the documents she had found. Harriet wasted no time. "Ellie, this isn't just about jealousy or insecurity anymore. He's involved in something big. And that photo, you need to find out who she is." Harriet suggested hiring a private investigator. At first, Eleanor hesitated, but her friend's insistence and her own curiosity eventually convinced her. A few days later, the investigator hired by Harriet delivered a preliminary report. What Eleanor read shook her to the core. Winston wasn't who he claimed to be. He had changed his name years ago and had a long history of debts and lawsuits tied to financial fraud schemes. Moreover, the woman in the photo was his ex-wife, who had apparently disappeared without a trace. Eleanor felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. She had trusted Winston, believed in the love he claimed to have, but now realized it was all part of a carefully planned facade. Determined to learn more, Eleanor decided to return to the cafe where she had seen Winston with the blonde woman. She waited patiently until she saw her again, sitting alone. Gathering her courage, Eleanor approached and said, "Excuse me, I know this might seem strange, but I need to talk to you about Winston." The woman, who introduced herself as Genevieve, looked visibly uncomfortable but eventually agreed to talk. What she revealed was even more devastating. "Winston promised me the same things he promised you. Love, security, a life together. But he only used my name to rack up debts. When I tried to leave, he threatened me." Genevieve explained that she, too, had been manipulated by Winston and was trying to warn him about potential investigations underway. "I don't know what he's planning now, but you need to be careful, Eleanor. He's not who you think he is." When Winston returned home that evening, Eleanor could no longer hide her anger. "Who are you, Winston?" she asked firmly. Winston, caught off guard, tried to stay calm. "What do you mean, Ellie? This is ridiculous." But Eleanor didn't back down. "I know about your ex-wife. I know about the schemes. And I know you've been lying to me from the start." For a moment, Winston remained silent, his expression shifting into something Eleanor had never seen before. He smiled, but it wasn't warm, it was cold and calculated. "I think you know more than you should, darling." After the confrontation, Eleanor felt that Winston's facade was beginning to crumble. But he wasn't a man who could be easily intimidated. Instead of admitting his wrongs, Winston changed his strategy, attempting to turn the situation around and emotionally manipulate Eleanor. After a few seconds of silence, Winston finally spoke in a calm but cutting tone. "Ellie, I'm disappointed. After everything I've done for us, do you really believe in baseless stories?" Eleanor was taken aback. She had expected confessions, maybe apologies, but not the manipulation that followed. "This is just a game played by jealous people trying to tear us apart. Don't you see? They can't stand to see us happy." Despite her anger and certainty that something was wrong, Eleanor felt her confidence waver. Winston was skilled with words, and even in the face of evidence, he managed to plant doubt in her mind. The next day, Eleanor received a call from Genevieve. Her voice was filled with urgency. "Eleanor, you need to leave that house. Winston is dangerous. He'll make you doubt yourself until you have no strength left." Eleanor hesitated. As much as she feared Winston, she wasn't ready to believe he could pose a direct threat. "I need more proof, Genevieve. I need to fully understand what he's done." Genevieve sighed but agreed. "Then promise me you'll protect yourself. Don't trust him, not for a second." That night, Winston noticed that Eleanor was more distant. He tried to get close to her, but she refused to discuss what she was feeling. "Do you think you can just pull away from me like this? After everything?" Winston asked, with a firmness Eleanor had never seen before. His voice, usually sweet, now carried an undertone of veiled threat. "I don't want to fight, Winston. I just need some time to think," she replied, trying to stay calm. But Winston wasn't willing to let her slip away so easily. He reminded her of how much he had benefited from their relationship, the gifts, the dinners, the trips, and hinted that, without him, she would return to a dull and lonely life. Eleanor began to feel suffocated. The man who once seemed like her Prince Charming was now revealing himself as controlling and calculating. Determined to protect herself, Eleanor decided to keep investigating Winston. She accessed his laptop again, and this time found a folder protected by a password. After several attempts, she managed to unlock it. Inside, she discovered a series of photos and documents revealing properties, bank accounts, and debts under the names of various women. Among the files was a fake marriage contract with Genevieve's name, dated 3 years earlier. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Winston wasn't just emotionally manipulating his victims, but also systematically exploiting them financially. Eleanor knew she was in danger, but couldn't act impulsively. She spoke with Harriet again, who suggested she leave the house and seek legal help immediately. "Ellie, you can't pretend this is just a complicated relationship anymore. He's dangerous, and you need protection." Eleanor began planning her exit carefully. She started moving some of her belongings to Harriet's house little by little, without Winston noticing. At the same time, she hired a lawyer to understand how to legally protect herself if he tried anything against her. It didn't take long for Winston to notice that Eleanor was different. He began pressing her more, trying to regain her trust while monitoring her every move. He constantly asked where she was going and who she was talking to. "Are you hiding something from me, Eleanor?" he asked, with an intense gaze that sent a chill down her spine. Eleanor smiled, pretending everything was normal. "Of course not, Winston. I've just been busy with work." She knew she was walking on a tightrope, but she also knew that the only way to escape was to remain calm and stick to her plan. Eleanor knew every step needed to be meticulously calculated. Any mistake could tip Winston off about her plan, and the risk of him reacting unpredictably was high. The tension in the house grew daily, but she remained steadfast, focused on her escape. The first thing Eleanor did was change all her passwords for bank accounts and electronic devices. With her lawyer's help, she managed to block Winston's access to any financial resources linked to her name. While pretending to maintain a normal relationship, she began stashing small amounts of cash in a safe place in case she needed to flee suddenly. She also activated a tracker on her phone, sharing her real-time location with Harriet to ensure her friend would know where she was if something happened. Winston began to sense something was wrong. He noticed Eleanor had become more reserved and that her gestures of affection seemed forced. One evening, he subtly confronted her. "You know, Ellie, sometimes I feel like you're hiding something from me. It's like you're pulling away." Eleanor, trying to maintain her composure, smiled and replied, "That's not it, Winston. It's just work. It's been stressful lately." But he didn't seem convinced. He started monitoring her schedule more closely, calling constantly to ask where she was and who she was with. The atmosphere at home grew heavy, and Eleanor felt like she was racing against time. Meanwhile, Harriet intensified her efforts to help Eleanor. She hired a private security guard to be on standby in case Eleanor needed immediate help. She also began digging deeper into Winston's schemes, trying to find something that could be used against him legally. Harriet suggested Eleanor leave a note explaining the situation in case she had to flee suddenly. "If something goes wrong, people need to know what happened," Harriet said. Reluctantly, Eleanor agreed, feeling like she was preparing for the worst. The next morning, Winston left for a meeting, and Eleanor saw her chance. She grabbed a suitcase she had discreetly packed with essentials and important documents and drove to Harriet's house. Upon arriving, she felt a temporary sense of relief but knew the battle was far from over. That night, Winston called several times, but Eleanor didn't answer. Finally, he sent a short, direct message. "Where are you? This won't end well." Eleanor froze as she read the words. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. With Harriet and her lawyer's support, Eleanor filed a restraining order against Winston, citing his controlling behavior and the evidence she had gathered about his illegal activities. While the process was an important step, she knew Winston wouldn't give up easily. As they awaited the court's decision, Eleanor and Harriet decided to expose Winston publicly. Harriet used her media connections to share details about his fraudulent schemes, including testimonies from other women who had been his victims. A few days later, Eleanor received an email from Winston. The tone was disturbingly calm. "You think you can destroy my life like this? You'll regret all of this, Eleanor." She showed the email to her lawyer, who advised using it as additional evidence. But the fear that Winston might try something worse began to haunt her. Meanwhile, the police began investigating Winston based on the evidence Eleanor and Harriet had gathered. With more victims coming forward and confirming his schemes, Winston was officially wanted for fraud and extortion. Eleanor felt she was close to finally breaking free, but the fear of retaliation made her look over her shoulder at every turn. She knew Winston was still out there and wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. With Winston being pursued by the police and Eleanor under legal protection, it seemed the walls were closing in on him. However, she knew Winston wasn't the type of man to give up easily. Every move he made was calculated, and the fear of retaliation kept Eleanor preparing for the worst. One quiet afternoon, Eleanor received an unexpected message from an unknown number. "He's watching you. Be careful." Eleanor's blood ran cold. Despite all the security measures she had taken, this message proved Winston still had allies or means to monitor her. Harriet insisted they increase their precautions. "This isn't just a simple threat, Ellie. He's planning something." Eleanor agreed and decided it was time to put into action the plan she had been working on with Harriet and her lawyer, exposing Winston in a setting where he couldn't escape. Harriet used her network of contacts to organize a charity event, similar to the one where Eleanor and Winston had first met. The idea was to create an opportunity for Winston to show up, believing he could manipulate the situation. Eleanor knew he wouldn't resist the chance to confront her publicly. With the help of the police, a surveillance operation was set up at the venue. Undercover investigators would be present, ready to act as soon as Winston made any mistake. Additionally, the victims who had joined the case against him were also invited, providing essential support for the plan. On the night of the event, Eleanor was visibly nervous but determined. She wore an elegant black dress that exuded confidence, even though her heart was racing. As she mingled with guests, she felt a chill run down her spine. Winston had arrived. He was impeccably dressed, as always, and exuded a disturbingly calm demeanor. He approached Eleanor with a forced smile. "So, you finally decided to come out of hiding, Ellie?" he said, his tone laced with challenge. Eleanor held her composure. "Not exactly how you imagined it. Is it, Winston?" He sensed something was off. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the room, assessing the environment. "What have you done?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. The moment Winston tried to leave the venue, plainclothes officers blocked his exit. He realized he was cornered. The victims present began pointing him out as the man who had deceived them, providing evidence directly to the investigators. Winston tried to maintain his innocent facade, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. "This is ridiculous. You're all falling for her plan," he shouted, attempting to turn the situation against Eleanor. But this time, no one believed his words. Authorities handcuffed him in front of everyone as he cast furious glances at Eleanor. "This isn't over, Ellie. You'll pay for this," he whispered as he was led away. Even with Winston in custody, Eleanor knew the nightmare wouldn't end so easily. His allies and the debts he had accrued still loomed over her like a shadow. Harriet tried to reassure her. "He's out of circulation, Ellie. Now you can start rebuilding your life." Despite the supportive words, Eleanor still looked over her shoulder. Every unexpected noise, every unidentified message, kept her on edge. But for the first time in months, she felt genuine relief knowing she had faced Winston and broken the cycle. With Winston in prison and the weight of his manipulation beginning to lift, Eleanor knew she was only at the start of a long journey to rebuild her life. Even surrounded by the support of Harriet and the authorities, she felt emotionally drained, her confidence shaken, and her dreams shattered. It was time to begin piecing herself back together. In the weeks following Winston's arrest, Eleanor struggled to sleep. Nightmares constantly transported her back to moments of tension, and any unexpected noise made her heart race. Harriet, always by her side, tried to offer support. "Ellie, you've been through trauma. It's okay to admit you need help to get through this." After some hesitation, Eleanor finally accepted Harriet's suggestion and began therapy. She knew that understanding what she had gone through was essential to rebuilding her strength and avoiding similar traps in the future. Beyond the emotional toll, Eleanor faced the harsh reality of the financial consequences Winston had left behind. Many of her accounts were frozen due to investigations into his schemes. With her lawyer's help, she began the process of reclaiming her money, though she knew it would be a long road. "I'm not going to let him ruin my life any more than he already has," Eleanor told Harriet during one of their many late-night talks. To cover her expenses while the situation was resolved, Eleanor sold some valuable belongings and accepted financial help from Harriet, something that would have hurt her pride in the past. Now, She saw it as a gesture of friendship and invaluable support. During the legal process, Eleanor had the chance to meet other women who had been Winston's victims. They shared similar stories, promises of love, emotional manipulation, and financial exploitation. "He made us believe we were special," Genevieve said during one of their group meetings. "And now we know the only power he had was what we allowed him to have." These conversations helped Eleanor realize she wasn't alone. Together, they began forming a support network for others who might be going through similar situations, encouraging reporting and offering guidance. With time, Eleanor began allowing herself small changes. She started revisiting places she loved, picking up old hobbies, and reconnecting with friends she had distanced herself from during her relationship with Winston. Though still cautious, she also began to entertain the idea of opening her heart again. During a therapy session, her psychologist suggested, "You can protect yourself without shutting the door on new experiences. The important thing is to trust your intuition and recognize the signs." Although hesitant, Eleanor knew she didn't want to live in fear for the rest of her life. Slowly, she began to consider the possibility of a lighter, brighter future. One day, Eleanor received an invitation to speak at a conference on overcoming abusive relationships. She had been recommended by Harriet and her lawyer, who believed her story could inspire others. Initially unsure, Eleanor decided to accept. During her speech, she shared her most vulnerable moments but also highlighted her strength in fighting against Winston and seeking justice. "It's not about avoiding falls, but about having the courage to get back up," she said, moving the audience. This moment marked the beginning of a new phase in her life, where she began transforming her pain into purpose. As Eleanor took her first steps toward recovery, Winston's trial progressed. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for fraud, extortion, and threats, and was ordered to partially repay his victims. When the verdict was read, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "Finally, he won't be able to do this to anyone else," she told Harriet. Although the trauma still lingered, knowing that Winston was out of circulation brought a sense of relief and justice. With Winston out of the picture and her life slowly getting back on track, Eleanor began to find new meaning in her experience. While the trauma was still part of her, Eleanor knew she didn't want to live as a victim. She wanted to transform her story into something bigger, something that could help others. After months of therapy, Eleanor felt it was time for a more significant change. She decided to move to a nearby town, seeking an environment where she could start fresh without the ghosts of her past lurking around every corner. "It's time to build something new, Harriet. Something that's truly mine," she told her friend. Harriet supported the decision, helping Eleanor find a small apartment in a welcoming town, with friendly people and the peace she needed to reassess her goals. In her new home, Eleanor began working on a project she had been envisioning since Winston's trial, creating an organization to help women recognize the signs of abusive and manipulative relationships. She invested her remaining savings into the project, with support from Harriet and other victims of Winston. Thus, Reclaiming Freedom was born, an initiative providing psychological, legal, and financial support to women in vulnerable situations. The work gave her a renewed sense of purpose. Seeing other women find the strength to leave similar situations motivated Eleanor to keep moving forward. Although busy with her new project, Eleanor still faced moments of fear. Every unknown call or unexpected notification on her phone made her question whether Winston had followed through on his threat to come back. But with each passing day, she realized her power lay in not letting fear control her. During a meeting at the organization, she shared, "He took a lot from me, but he won't take my freedom to live." These words not only inspired other women but also became a mantra Eleanor repeated to herself. One day, while attending a conference on mental health and resilience, Eleanor met Merrick, a therapist who worked with trauma survivors. During a coffee break, they began talking about their experiences and quickly realized they shared the same goal of helping others. Merrick, with his calm voice and light sense of humor, managed to make Eleanor smile in a way she hadn't in a long time. "Have you ever thought that sometimes the hardest moments are what connect us to the right people?" he asked. Though cautious, Eleanor felt that this encounter could mark the start of something new, even as she continued to learn how to trust again. As her life took new directions, Eleanor decided to reconnect with some people she had distanced herself from during her relationship with Winston. She arranged meetings with old friends, apologized for pulling away, and began rebuilding important relationships. These moments brought a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in a long time. It was as if, little by little, she was rediscovering the person she had been before Winston entered her life. With reclaiming freedom, growing and new connections forming in her life, Eleanor realized she was ready to face the future with her head held high. While the scars from her experience remained, she now saw them as marks of survival and strength. During a speech at a charity event, Eleanor shared, "My life was torn apart by a man who tried to dim my light. But today, I know that every step, even the most painful ones, brought me here. And here is a place of strength, not fear." Her words were met with a standing ovation, a symbol that her journey was inspiring others to start over as well. Despite the progress Eleanor was making, she knew the road to complete peace was still long. Each step took her further from Winston and the pain he caused. But deep wounds don't heal easily. With reclaiming freedom growing, new connections forming, and a clearer purpose guiding her days, Eleanor began to explore what it truly meant to live again. Over time, Eleanor realized she had something that once seemed impossible: the freedom to choose what to do with her life. Without Winston controlling her every move, she felt like she had reclaimed a part of herself that had been lost. She began planning small trips to nearby towns, something she had always wanted to do but never found the time for. "I want to see the world through my own eyes, without anyone telling me where to go," she told Harriet, who encouraged her to move forward. These moments were fundamental for Eleanor to rediscover who she truly was. One morning, Eleanor found an unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note. "You may think you're safe, but I never forget." Signed, W. Her heart raced. Although she knew Winston was in prison, the message felt like a reminder that his influence still lingered. She took the letter directly to the police, who assured her it would be investigated. Harriet tried to reassure her. "It could just be someone trying to scare you, Ellie. But don't let it stop you from living. You've already won the biggest battle." Though still shaken, Eleanor refused to let fear regain control over her. It was another obstacle to overcome. With the help of therapy, Eleanor realized her relationship with her family had weakened during her time with Winston. She decided to reconnect, starting with her sister, Lillian, who lived in another state. When she visited, Eleanor was greeted with a warm hug. "I missed you so much, Ellie. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to help," Lillian said, emotionally. Over the weekend, the two spoke openly, and Eleanor realized how much her family connection could be a source of healing. As she continued developing reclaiming freedom, Merrick became a constant presence in Eleanor's life. He didn't pressure her, respecting her pace and offering genuine support. In a moment of honesty, Merrick asked, "Eleanor, what do you want most right now?" She replied with a smile, "I want to learn to trust again, but on my own terms." They began meeting more often, developing a solid friendship that slowly started to evolve into something deeper. For Eleanor, it was proof that love and trust didn't have to be forced. They could grow naturally. One day, while reviewing stories of women helped by her organization, Eleanor realized the impact she was making. She had turned her pain into something that was changing lives. "I'm so much stronger than I ever thought I could be," she told Harriet, tears in her eyes. Harriet, always her biggest supporter, replied, "You didn't just survive, Ellie. You thrived." As part of her therapy, Eleanor wrote a letter to herself, reflecting on everything she had endured and achieved. "Dear Eleanor, you were knocked down, but you rose stronger than ever. You lost pieces of yourself, but found something even more valuable: your courage and your capacity to love, even after so much pain. Never forget how much you've grown. You deserve all the happiness you're building." This symbolic act marked the closure of a chapter. Eleanor realized that while the scars were permanent, they wouldn't define her future. After everything she had been through, Eleanor finally began to feel she was leaving the past behind. The emotional scars were still there, but now she saw them as symbols of her strength. Her work with reclaiming freedom was thriving, her connection with Merrick was growing naturally, and her family relationships were stronger than ever. Eleanor was ready to embrace a new horizon. As the organization grew, Eleanor realized she could help even more people. She and Harriet began planning the opening of a second center in another city, expanding the project's reach. "It's amazing to think about where this all started, Ellie," Harriet said during a meeting. "I couldn't have done it without you, Harriet. You always believed in me, even when I doubted myself," Eleanor replied. The new facility would be funded by donations, many from women who had been helped by the organization. Seeing the impact of her work filled Eleanor with pride and hope. Her friendship with Merrick continued to grow, but Eleanor still had reservations about opening herself up completely. One day, while walking together in a park, Merrick stopped and looked her in the eyes. "Eleanor, I don't want to rush anything, but I need to say that I deeply admire the woman you are." Eleanor was silent for a moment, feeling the weight of his words. She knew opening her heart was a risk, but also a chance to find something real. "I'm still learning to trust, Merrick, but I want to try." They continued walking, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor felt she was ready for something new, even if it was one step at a time. Meanwhile, the investigations into Winston continued to uncover new layers of his crimes. More victims came forward, strengthening the case against him. He was sentenced to additional time for financial crimes and threats, ensuring he would remain behind bars for a long time. When Eleanor received the news, she felt a mix of relief and closure. "Now, he won't be able to hurt anyone else," she told Harriet, who nodded with an approving smile. This confirmation allowed Eleanor to put a definitive end to the darkest chapter of her life. Eleanor was invited to be the keynote speaker at an international event on resilience and overcoming adversity. During her speech, she shared her story but focused on the lessons and strength she had gained along the way. "Pain can destroy us, but it can also transform us. Today, I choose transformation," she said, receiving a standing ovation. The experience was liberating. For the first time, Eleanor felt she was fully in control of her story. On the anniversary of Winston's arrest, Eleanor organized a symbolic ceremony with her team and the women who had been helped by Reclaiming Freedom. Together, they wrote letters about their struggles and victories and burned them in a bonfire, symbolizing the closure of their traumas. As the flames danced in the air, Eleanor reflected on how much she had changed. "I never imagined I'd be here, feeling peace, surrounded by so many amazing people," she told Merrick, who stood by her side. He smiled and took her hand. "You deserve this, Eleanor, and so much more." With new projects, strengthened relationships, and renewed determination, Eleanor was ready to face whatever came next. She knew the future would still bring challenges, but now she was equipped with something Winston could never take from her: her unshakable strength. As she gazed at the horizon of her new city, Eleanor smiled, knowing that, despite everything, she had won. If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel and press the like button. Thank you. Eleanor's past, though marked by pain and challenges, became the foundation of her new life. She no longer saw Winston as a shadow but as a closed chapter, something that shaped her resilience and led her to the path she now walked. Every day, Eleanor chose to live with purpose, gratitude, and hope. Reclaiming Freedom continued to grow, becoming one of the leading organizations supporting vulnerable women. With new centers and innovative programs, Eleanor often received messages of gratitude from women who found strength through the institution's work. "Every story is proof that what we do matters," she told Harriet during a planning meeting. Harriet smiled. "And all of this started with your courage to face the impossible, Ellie." The organization also began attracting international attention, leading Eleanor to establish partnerships with institutions in other countries, further expanding the reach of her mission. Her connection with Merrick continued to blossom with patience and respect. One quiet afternoon, as they shared coffee on a small terrace, Merrick held Eleanor's hand. "Have you ever thought about how much you've accomplished since the day we met?" Eleanor laughed, her eyes shining with a mix of happiness and reflection. "Sometimes it feels surreal, but it also reminds me that there's always a way to start over." Merrick wasn't just a romantic partner. He had become a true companion, someone who inspired and supported her in every moment. On the second anniversary of Winston's arrest, Eleanor organized a special event for Reclaiming Freedom. The theme was Celebrating Freedom, and hundreds of women and families attended, sharing stories of resilience and renewal. During the event, Eleanor took the stage and, before the crowd, shared her thoughts. "Freedom is more than being away from what hurts us. It's finding within ourselves the strength to believe we deserve something better. Today, we're all here because we chose that freedom." Warm applause filled the space, and Eleanor felt a deep sense of purpose. As the years went by, Eleanor continued to grow. She became recognized for her resilience and dedication while maintaining her humility and focus on helping others. Her story was transformed into an inspiration for thousands, proving that even the darkest moments can give way to brighter days. One sunny morning, as she walked along the beach with Merrick, Eleanor stopped to gaze at the horizon. "You know, sometimes I think all of this was just a dream," she said. Merrick smiled and replied, "It wasn't a dream, Ellie. It was you choosing to truly live." And at that moment, Eleanor knew her future was full of possibilities, built by the choices she had made herself.